The town of Ironwood called her the thief's widow and made her carry a dead man's sentence long after the prison took him. And the first hard blizzard of that winter caught her on the mercantile steps with a small son, a cold stove behind a bolted back room door, and 3 days of wood until the freight sledge stopped. She had been turned out that very morning, her few crates stacked in the snow, her boy holding the edge of her skirt as a child holds the one thing he is sure of. And the town watched from behind its frost-glazed windows, and the town waited to be proven right about her, and not one soul came down off a porch. That is where the story truly starts. Not with the robbing, with the storm. Her name was Adeline, though for 4 winters hardly a mouth in Ironwood had used it. She had come to the territory a bride of 19, sweet on a charming man who could make a whole feed store laugh while he counted their coins wrong in his own favor. His name does not much matter now, the tone remembers it plenty. He robbed the feed store he charmed, and he robbed 2 neighbors who had fed him at their tables, and he was caught with another man's saddle and another man's savings, and he died of a prison fever 3 years later without ever once sending his wife a word of sorrow. What he left her was a name like a brand, a boy of 7, and a debt she had never borrowed a cent of. And Adeline did not argue it. That was the part the town could not forgive. She never argued. A woman who wept and begged might have been pitied. A woman who stood straight and asked nobody for anything only reminded them of what they meant to withhold. She scrubbed the church floor on her knees for pennies and would not take a penny more than the work was worth. She took in mending and left it folded on the step without knocking. She let her boy wear his boots until the toes split rather than owe the cobbler a favor she could not repay. Pride, the town said, as if pride in a poor woman were a kind of theft too. The busybody of Ironwood was a wide, warm-seeming soul named Mrs. Pruitt, who could carry a rumor across a valley faster than a telegraph and call it Christian concern the whole way. And the deacon was a lean, upright man named Odell, who had a proverb for every closed door. It was Odell who first said the thing that stuck, said it in the mercantile with a dozen ears leaning in, said it low and certain, a thief's woman keeps a thief's ways. And Mrs. Pruitt carried it home, and it went round Ironwood like a hymn everyone already knew, until it was not a thing the deacon had said, but a thing the town simply knew, as surely as it knew the price of flour and the length of Lent. So when the mercantile owner needed the back room for stock and put her crates in the snow, no man called it cruel. They called it prudent. The owner would not even meet her eye while he did it. "It's nothing personal, ma'am," he told the boards under his feet. "A man's got to store his winter stock somewhere, and folks don't much care to trade in a store that keeps your kind out the back." "I've never asked you to keep me anywhere," Adeline said, and her voice did not shake. "I paid my rent to the day, in coin, every week I was here. You'll not find a soul who can say different. Put my crates where you please. I'll trouble you for nothing but the cold air, which I believe is still free in this town." And she picked up the first box herself and would not let him touch the rest. And the blizzard came on hard by noon, the sky going the color of dishwater, the wind finding every gap in her shawl, and Adeline stood on those steps with her boy and her boxes and did the only arithmetic a body can do at such a time, which of them, the boy or the woman, would last the cold the longer, and how she might spend herself to buy him an hour. That was the moment the freight sledge came down the white street with its bells muffled by snow. The man driving it was a widower named Silas Hart, who ran freight between Ironwood and the rail camp 40 miles east, and who had at home a motherless baby girl not yet weaned off grief and a silent boy of his own who had not said a full sentence since the fever took his mother in the spring. Silas Hart was no lord in disguise and no rich man's son. He was a plain freighter with cracked hands and a good team, equal in station to any soul on that street and better in heart than most. He had heard the talk. Everyone had heard the talk. He pulled the team up short at the steps and sat looking a moment at the woman and the boy and the crates going white in the drift. Then he climbed down, and he took off his hat, and he held it in both hands in front of a street full of watching windows, and the snow fell on his bare head while he said it plain enough for every one of them to hear. "Ma'am," he said, "there's a warm kitchen and a strong door. Let them talk till the thaw." That was all of it. No price named, no work required, no trade proposed. Not can you cook, not can you sew, not can you earn it. Only the fire and the bolted door, and the whole gossiping town dared to make what it liked of the offer. Adeline stood very still, the pride in her fighting the cold in her son's blue lips, and she did not weep and she did not thank him overmuch. She only looked at him a long moment and said, "My boy first. Warm, my boy, and I'll not forget it. Whatever the rest of them make of it." "Your boy first," Silas agreed, and lifted the child up onto the seat, and stacked her crates in the sledge, and drove the both of them out of Ironwood, while every curtain in town twitched shut. His house sat a mile past the last fence, a low log place with smoke already rising, and he did the thing right, so no tongue could make it wrong. He built the kitchen fire high, and set soup to warming, and hung her wet shawl by the stove. He put her and the boy in the front room with its own bed and its own bolt on the inside of a stout door, and he showed her the bolt, and he showed her the key was hers. And that same evening he rode out through the drift and fetched back his hired man's wife, a steady woman named Mrs. Beck, to sleep under the same roof and see with her own eyes that everything beneath it was decent. "So there's a witness," he said simply, "not for me, for you. A woman ought to have a witness who's on her side." The talk started before the soup was cold. Mrs. Pruitt came calling the second the Rhodes let a buggy through, all warmth and worry, and stood in Silas Hart's kitchen and said what half of Ironwood had sent her to say, that a man had his good name to think of, that a thief's widow under his roof would tar him with her own brush, that folks were saying things, and did he not care what folks were saying? Silas Hart set down the harness he was mending and looked at her a good while before he answered, and when he did his voice was mild as milk and hard as a horseshoe underneath. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, "I've thought about my good name. I have. And I've decided a man who'd let a widow and a little boy freeze on the steps to keep his name clean has got no name worth the keeping. You take that back to whoever sent you, and you tell them the door's bolted and the stove's warm and the child's got color in his face again, and if that shames somebody, then somebody ought to be ashamed." Mrs. Pruitt went home with nothing to carry but that, and it did not travel near so sweet as the deacon's proverb had. Now here is the part the tongues of Ironwood never once suspected, and it is the truest thing in the whole account. Silas Hart had not taken Adeline in because she was useful. He took her in when she was nothing to him but a cold woman on a step. But a house that has lost its mother is a house with a broken clock in it, and Adeline, without a word about it, began to wind that clock again. The baby girl had colicked every night since the spring, screamed the dark hours through till the hired girl quit, and Silas himself walked the floor gray-faced. The first night Adeline was under that roof she heard the baby start, and she rose without being asked, and she took the child up and did something no one in that house had thought to do. She wrapped her tight and warm as a seed in a husk, and she walked slow, and she sang low in her chest, an old cradle tune with no words anybody knew, and she pressed the small hot back against the beat of her own heart, and the baby, who had cried through every arms in the county, went quiet against the thief's widow inside a quarter hour, and slept the whole night for the first time in her short, grieving life. Silas Hart stood in the dark of the doorway and watched it and did not say one word. He only leaned there a long time, and then went back to his bed and lay awake in a house gone suddenly, impossibly quiet. The silent boy took longer, for grief in a child is a locked room. Adeline did not knock on it. She only left the door of herself standing open. She set an extra biscuit by his plate and never mentioned it. She mended the ear back onto a cloth rabbit that had lost it and left the rabbit on his pillow and said nothing. Her own boy, glad of a playmate, filled the silence with enough talk for two. And one gray afternoon, weeks in, the silent boy carried her a dead sparrow he had found frozen under the eave, carried it careful in both small hands like a question, and Adeline knelt down in the snow with him, and they buried it under the fence with a flat stone on top, and the boy looked up at her and said, "Will my ma be cold like that?" And it was the first whole sentence he had spoken since April. Adeline told him no. She told him his ma was past all cold now, warm as a kitchen, and she held him while he cried it out at last, and the house had one more room unlocked in it that night. And all the while, no one saw the other thing she did. Twice a week, before the light, Adeline slipped out into the cold with a small cloth pouch and her mending money knotted inside it, and she walked the mile into Ironwood in the dark, and she left the pouch on a doorstep, and she walked home before the town was awake. She had been doing it since October, before Silas Hart, before the eviction, before any of it. Coin by hard-scrubbed coin, at the doors of the feed store and the 2 neighbors her husband had robbed. She never signed a note. She never asked a thank you. She was paying back a debt no court had assigned her, out of a purse that could not spare it, because she could not carry the name and abide the thing the name meant both at once. The storm settled in for a long while and closed the roads for the better part of a month, and inside the low log house a strange and easy weather set in. Mrs. Beck slept by the stove and knit, and kept her watchful, kindly eyes on all of it. There were suppers where the boys laughed. There were mornings the baby reached for Adeline first. There was a night Silas Hart mended her son's split boots without being asked and set them by the fire, and a night she darned the elbows of his only good coat, and neither of them said a word about what any of it meant, because to name it would have been to spend it before its time. Out in town, though, one voice had begun to answer the gossip. Mrs. Beck was not a woman to sit on a truth. "I have slept under that roof a month," she told the sewing circle flat out, "and I will tell you what I have seen, which is more than the rest of you can say. I have seen a decent man and a decent woman, and 2 mended children, and I have seen nothing else, and I am done listening to those who've seen nothing at all. But a town that has built a verdict does not surrender it to one plain woman's word." Deacon Odell, who felt the ground shifting, did what such men do. He called a meeting. He called it a matter for the church, a matter of the congregation's good conscience, and he set it for the first Sunday the roads cleared, in the meeting house, in front of everyone. And he meant to shame Silas Hart into putting the thief's widow out, and to shame Adeline back into her proper corner. They came in their Sunday wool and filled the benches, and the stove ticked, and Deacon Odell stood up front with his proverb ready and laid the charge, that a man of the congregation was harboring a woman of ill name, that the arrangement was a scandal on them all, that a thief's woman keeps a thief's ways, and the town had a Christian duty to say so out loud. Silas Hart rose from the back bench with his hat in his hands. "You want to talk about ways," he said, and his voice carried the length of that cold room. "Let's talk about ways. It was your way to put a woman and a child in the snow and call it prudence. It was your way to hang a dead man's crime on a living woman who never took a thing that wasn't hers. I'll tell you what I've seen of her ways under my own roof this winter. I've seen her quiet a motherless baby that grief near killed. I've seen her give my grieving boy back his own voice. I've seen her go without so a child could have. That's the ways she keeps, Deacon. Now you name me the ways you keep, and let's see which of us the good book would rather sit beside." The room was dead still, and into that stillness, before the deacon could gather his proverb back up, the blacksmith stood. He was a big, quiet man named Halloran, who had said maybe 40 words all winter, and he had one thing in his fist, and he held it up over his head so the whole meeting could see it, a small cloth pouch, coins showing at the mouth of it. "Somebody's been leaving these," Halloran said. "Since October, on the feed store step. On my step, your husband took my grandfather's watch, and I never thought to see a cent of it, and here's been the money coming back, a little at a time, in the dark, no name on it. I found one froze to my door this week, and I got tired of wondering. So I followed the boot prints out through the snow this morning, small boots, out the east road, past the last fence. He turned then, and he looked straight down the bench at Adeline, and every head in that meeting-house turned with him. They led to your door, ma'am. You've been paying back what you never stole. In the cold, before light, for near a year. And the whole room turned at once, like a field of grain in a single gust, and it did not turn toward the deacon. Mrs. Pruitt put her hand to her mouth. An old man wept without hiding it, and Deacon Odell stood alone up front with his proverb dead in his throat, shamed not by any cruelty of theirs, but by the plain weight of his own words handed back to him. For he had promised them a thief's ways in her, and here was the whole town looking at a woman who had spent a year keeping the opposite in secret. Nobody put Adeline out of Ironwood after that Sunday. The feed-store man tried to give the money back, and she would not take it. And that was the end of the matter, and the town that had passed its verdict quietly reversed it the only honest way a town ever can, which is one shamed neighbor at a time. The thaw came late, as it does in high country, water running under the last gray snow, and the roads going to mud and then to grass. And when the winter was truly over, and she was free to go anywhere she pleased, owing not one soul a thing, her debts finished, and her name her own again, that is when Silas Hart set his hat aside and asked her. He did it careful. He told her first that she was free, that she owed him nothing, that the door had never been a cage, that she could walk into any life she chose, and he would drive her there himself and wish her well. And then, only then, once she was standing on ground she owned free and clear, he asked her to stay, not out of rescue and not out of debt, but because a man is allowed to want a good woman for no reason but that she is good. And Adeline, who had not wept on the mercantile steps and had not wept at the meeting, wept a little then, and gave him her answer, and it was the longest speech anybody had ever heard from the quiet thief's widow. For 4 winters, she said, this town called me the thief's widow, and I let it, because a name is only a coat, and I had colder things to fret over. But I'll tell you what I know, that they never troubled to learn. I never took a thing in my life that wasn't mine to take. Not a coin, not a favor, not a kindness I hadn't earned, nothing but the cold, and I took plenty of that. My husband stole. I paid. That was the whole of it. And you, Silas Hart, you didn't hand me a roof because I was any use to you. You hadn't seen me sing a baby down or give a boy his words back. You handed it to me when I was nothing but a woman freezing on a step, and you told a whole town to talk till the thaw. Well, the thaw's come. And they can talk all they please now, because I'm not the thief's widow any more. I'm just Adeline. And I believe I'll stay. They married that spring in the same meeting-house where they had been put on trial, and the deacon did not speak against it. And Mrs. Beck cried in the front bench, and the 2 boys stood up together, and the baby girl, walking now, took her first sure steps down the aisle into Adeline's arms. The years came on as years do in that country, hard and then gentle and then hard again. The baby girl grew tall and called her mother and never knew a day she had not been loved. The silent boy grew loud and married a girl from the rail camp. Her own son took over the freight line when Silas Hart's hands finally gave out. And there were grandchildren on the porch of the low log house of a summer evening, more of them than the fingers on both her hands. Ironwood came, in time, to speak her name with respect, and then with fondness, and at last, as though it had always been so for a town, will rewrite its own memory to spare itself the shame of it. And when they were very old, Silas Hart went first, on a mild autumn night, with her hand in his, and Adeline followed him one hard winter after, and the town buried them side by side under a single flat stone up on the hill, close by a smaller stone she had set there long before for a frozen sparrow. And that was the story of Adeline, the woman a whole town called a thief's widow, who never stole so much as an hour of warmth she hadn't paid for twice over, who was handed a warm kitchen and a strong door on the worst day of her life by a man who didn't care who talked, and who paid the whole world back in secret and in the cold, and who, when the thaw finally came, was chosen freely and out loud and took back nothing in the end but her own good name. If this one warmed you tonight, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I hope it found you well. I'll see you in the next one.